The wind cut through the frozen trees like a blade, sharp and silent, as the snow-covered fields of East Prussia stretched endlessly under a pale gray sky. It was January 1945, just after dawn, and somewhere beyond the tree line, a low, heavy engine growl echoed through the cold air. German tank crews had heard that sound before, and most of them laughed when they did. They called it slow, clumsy, outdated. They said it was nothing to fear.
If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below.
But on this morning, one of those men would watch in disbelief as a single shell turned everything he believed about armored warfare into shattered steel. Inside a Panther tank, positioned near the village of Nemmersdorf, Oberleutnant Karl-Heinz Richter adjusted his binoculars and scanned the horizon. The ground ahead looked empty, but something felt wrong. The silence was too heavy, the kind that comes before something breaks. His loader, Gefreiter Otto Weiss, wiped frost from his hands and muttered about Soviet tanks again, about how they were loud and slow, easy targets if you kept your distance. The Panther, after all, was one of Germany's finest machines. It had a powerful 75mm KWK-42 gun, excellent optics, and thick, sloped armor. It was designed to hunt tanks like the Soviet IS-2. And yet, somewhere out there, one was coming. The IS-2, officially the Iosif Stalin tank, had earned a strange reputation among German crews. It carried a massive 122mm gun, but it fired slowly, very slowly. German soldiers joked that after firing one shot, the Soviet crew had time to drink tea before loading the next. Panther crews believed that if they stayed calm and kept their distance, they could fire 3, maybe 4 shots before the IS-2 was ready again. That advantage, they thought, made all the difference. But war rarely follows the logic of confidence. At around 8:15 hours, the first sign appeared. A distant rumble, deeper than usual, followed by the faint silhouette of a heavy tank moving between the trees. It was larger than a T-34, taller, heavier, with a thick turret that seemed almost oversized. The IS-2 had arrived. Richter lowered his binoculars slowly. "Range, approximately 1,200 meters," he said quietly, more to himself than to his crew. His gunner, Unteroffizier Franz Keller, adjusted the sight and waited for the order. They had the advantage of position, of training, of precision. This should have been simple. The IS-2 rolled forward, its wide tracks crushing snow and ice beneath its weight. Inside, the Soviet crew worked with focus and discipline. The commander, Captain Nikolai Sokolov of the 11th Guards Heavy Tank Regiment, leaned forward in his hatch, scanning the terrain. He had been in battles from Kursk to the Vistula. He knew exactly what a Panther could do. He also knew what his own tank was capable of. The IS-2 stopped briefly, its turret turning slowly, searching. The Germans were well hidden, but not invisible. Sokolov sensed something ahead. He gave a short command, and his gunner began aligning the massive D-25T cannon. Back in the Panther, Richter felt a strange tension building. The Soviet tank had not rushed forward blindly. It had paused, observed. That was not what he expected. "Fire first," he ordered. Keller squeezed the trigger. The Panther's gun roared, the recoil shaking the turret. The shell flew across the frozen field and struck the IS-2's frontal armor with a sharp impact. Snow and sparks burst outward. For a moment, it looked like a clean hit, but the IS-2 kept moving. Inside the Soviet tank, the crew barely reacted. The shell had struck the thick glacis plate at an angle, failing to penetrate. Sokolov didn't waste time. "Return fire," he commanded. The loader, Sergeant Ivan Petrov, was already at work. Loading a 122mm shell was no easy task. It was a two-part ammunition system, meaning the projectile and the propellant charge had to be loaded separately. It required strength, coordination, and precious seconds. Seconds that German crews believed they could exploit. In the Panther, Keller quickly adjusted his aim for a second shot. "Target still active," he said, a hint of surprise in his voice. Richter leaned closer to the periscope. The IS-2 was turning its turret directly toward them now. "Fire again," he ordered. The second shot left the barrel with a flash and thunder. This time, the shells struck closer to the turret. Again, sparks and debris flew. Again, no penetration. For the first time, doubt crept into Richter's mind. Inside the IS-2, Petrov slammed the heavy shell into the breech, sweat forming despite the cold. The propellant charge followed. The breech closed with a solid final sound. The gunner adjusted his aim, steady and calm. Sokolov gave a single word: "Fire." The world seemed to pause for a fraction of a second as the massive gun unleashed its power. The 122mm shell tore through the air with unstoppable force. In the Panther, Keller saw it coming too late. There was no time to react, no time to adjust. The shell struck the front of the tank with a violent explosion that felt more like a collision than a hit. The armor, strong as it was, could not fully withstand the impact. The shell penetrated, and what followed was chaos. Inside the Panther, everything turned into fire and metal fragments. The ammunition ignited instantly. The explosion ripped through the interior, tearing the tank apart from within. The force was so great that parts of the turret were blown open and flames burst out into the freezing air. From a distance, it looked as if the Panther had been split open. The IS-2 remained still for a moment, its gun smoking, its crew silent. Sokolov watched the burning wreck through his optics. He knew what had just happened. One shot, one decisive, devastating shot. The myth of slow reload no longer mattered. Across the battlefield, other German crews witnessed the destruction. The idea that the IS-2 was just a slow, lumbering target suddenly felt dangerously outdated. Yes, it fired slowly. Yes, it required time to reload. But if even one of those shells found its mark, the result was catastrophic. The psychological effect was immediate. In nearby positions, Panther and Panzer IV crews began to reposition, some pulling back slightly, others searching more carefully before exposing themselves. The confidence that had once defined their approach was now replaced with caution. The IS-2 had changed the equation. Back inside the Soviet tank, Petrov was already preparing the next round. His hands moved quickly, despite the weight and the pressure. He knew that every second counted. Sokolov scanned for new targets. He had no intention of wasting the advantage they had just demonstrated. But this moment, this single shot, did not happen in isolation. It was the result of years of design, experience, and brutal lessons learned across the Eastern Front. The IS-2 was born out of necessity. Earlier, Soviet heavy tanks like the KV-1 had strong armor, but lacked the firepower needed to deal with newer German designs. By late 1943, after the Battle of Kursk, Soviet engineers and commanders realized they needed something more powerful, something that could not just survive hits, but deliver a decisive blow in return. That led to the development of the IS-2, equipped with the 122mm D-25T gun. This weapon was originally based on an artillery piece, adapted for tank use. It was not designed for rapid-fire duels. It was designed to destroy, to break through armor, to shatter bunkers, to end a fight in one shot if it landed correctly, and that was exactly what German crews underestimated. Many German tank commanders were trained to think in terms of speed and precision. Their tanks, especially the Panther, were built for long-range engagements. The Panther's gun could penetrate most enemy armor at distance, and its optics allowed for accurate targeting. In theory, this gave them the upper hand. But theory often breaks under pressure. By early 1945, German forces were stretched thin. Fuel shortages, lack of experienced crews, and constant pressure from advancing Soviet forces created conditions where perfect engagements were rare. Tanks were often forced into close combat, into situations where reaction time mattered less than raw power. And in those moments, the IS-2 became terrifying. Another engagement took place later that same day, not far from Nemmersdorf. A small group of German tanks attempted to flank advancing Soviet armor near a frozen road leading toward Gumbinnen. Among them was a second Panther, commanded by Lieutenant Ernst Vogel. Vogel had heard about the earlier destruction over the radio. At first, he dismissed it as exaggerated battlefield chatter, but as he moved into position and spotted an IS-2 advancing between damaged buildings, he felt a tension he had not experienced before. He knew now that one mistake could be fatal. The Panther stopped behind partial cover, its engine idling low. Vogel waited for the right moment. The IS-2 was moving slowly, scanning just like before. "Aim for the side," Vogel ordered quietly. His gunner fired. The shell struck the IS-2's side armor, causing visible damage. This time it penetrated partially, but not enough to disable the tank. Smoke began to rise, but the Soviet tank did not stop. Inside, Sokolov felt the impact. The crew reacted quickly, checking for internal damage. The tank was still operational. That was enough. "Target left," Sokolov ordered. Again, Petrov began the heavy, exhausting process of loading the next round. Every movement inside that steel space required effort. The shell was heavy. The space was tight. The pressure was constant. Seconds passed. Vogel knew this was his window. "Reload, quickly," he urged. The Panther fired again. This time the shot missed, striking debris nearby. Snow and rubble exploded into the air, and in that moment the balance shifted. The IS-2 was ready. The second Soviet shell left the barrel with the same unstoppable force. It struck the Panther at an angle, hitting the turret ring area. The impact was devastating. The turret jammed instantly, and internal damage spread through the fighting compartment. The Panther did not explode like the first one, but it was effectively destroyed. The crew had seconds to escape. Some did, some did not. The battlefield fell quiet again, but the lesson was now undeniable. The IS-2 was not just a slow tank, it was a threat that demanded respect. By February 1945, German field manuals and reports began to change tone. Instead of dismissing Soviet heavy tanks, they warned crews to avoid direct engagement unless necessary. Commanders were told to coordinate attacks, to use terrain, to never assume that a single hit would be enough. Because sometimes it wasn't, and sometimes you didn't get a second chance. As Soviet forces continued their push toward Berlin, the IS-2 played a major role in urban combat. In cities like Königsberg and later Berlin, its heavy gun was used not just against tanks, but against fortified buildings, barricades, and defensive positions. One shell could bring down walls, collapse strong points, and open paths for advancing infantry. The slow reload still mattered. In close urban combat, those seconds could be dangerous, but Soviet crews adapted. They worked in groups, covering each other, ensuring that no IS-2 was left exposed during its reload cycle. Coordination replaced speed, power replaced volume of fire, and that combination proved effective. You can almost feel the weight of those moments inside those tanks where every decision mattered. The cold metal, the tight space, the constant noise of engines and distant explosions, the knowledge that somewhere out there another tank is aiming at you, and you only need to be wrong once. For German crews, the shift from confidence to caution was not immediate, but it was real. Stories spread, not just rumors, but confirmed reports of Panthers and Tigers being destroyed by single hits. Crews began to respect the IS-2, not because of what it could do over time, but because of what it could do instantly. One shot. That was all it took. And for the men who witnessed it, who saw a powerful machine torn apart in seconds, that truth stayed with them long after the battle ended. Because in war, it is not always the fastest weapon that wins. Sometimes it is the one that hits the hardest. And on that frozen morning in January 1945, in the fields near Nemmersdorf, that truth became impossible to ignore.
If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below.